Hey, and welcome back to this budget, where we're going to walk you through how to build your overhead budget. Remembering back to the intro video, or if you didn't see the intro video, overhead costs are costs that you don't recover when you estimate. So just in case you didn't watch the introduction video, it's really common for people to look at the way their accountant has set up their overhead and how LMN defines their overhead, and they'll see a difference. Generally, accountants haven't run landscape companies and don't often bid or know how you bid your jobs. But it's pretty easy to understand this concept here. And if your accountant doesn't necessarily subscribe to this method, it's probably worth explaining to them. There's two types of costs in your company, and there's only two ways you can recover a cost. When you estimate a job to a customer, you're probably calculating the cost of that job, labor hours, material costs, etc. And then you're applying a markup or a price to all those costs for your customer. Now, because you don't estimate things like cell phones and advertising and your rent, the markups that you add to the materials and labor that you do estimate have to be enough to cover your overhead and, of course, a fair net profit. The only way to be sure that you're doing that properly is to split your company's financials by job costs and overhead costs. How do you split that? Black and white rule. Things that you estimate are job costs. Things that you don't estimate are overhead costs. And then you can be certain that your overhead markups that you charge on a job cover your overhead costs. And of course, we get profit on top of that. So now that we're building the overhead budget, just understand clearly everything in the overhead budget should be things that you don't estimate. Shouldn't be in any other budget. And if you're doing your overhead budget from your current accounting and you come across something like maybe equipment rentals that you actually do estimate, it shouldn't go in here. That should go into one of the other budgets we built. So now that we've got that rule covered, let's dive right into the overhead budget. To get there, I'm on the budget screen. I'm going to click the overhead budget here. If you're using a sample or if you're copying one that you've seen in the past, you'll see all your overhead expenses in here. Or if you're looking at one of our samples, all our sample overhead expenses are there. The overhead budget's actually broken out into three categories. Expenses, those are like general expenses, advertising, cell phone, etc. Wages, these would be the wages that you pay overhead staff. That is staff whose time you don't estimate. Bookkeepers, office managers, mechanics, and very oftentimes the owner. And then here we've got overhead equipment, and that would be for equipment that you don't estimate. Owner's truck, salespeople's vehicles, any piece of equipment. Maybe it's a skid steer or loader that's parked at the yard. Any equipment that doesn't get estimated needs to go into your overhead so that your overhead markups cover those pieces of equipment. Let's go back to expenses and tackle that first. So looking at our sample, you'll see our expenses, the sample ones anyway, have been broken out into marketing, finance, admin, business development, etc. If you like our structure, by all means, we're happy to let you use it. You can start leveraging our data here. Here you've got previous, that's what you spent last year. And here you got forecast, that's what you think you're going to spend next year. And you can get started really easy just by editing our sample data with your numbers. If you'd rather use your accounting, that's no problem too. You can either change the names of our sample data or you can delete them and replace it with your own. Just remember, you've got your overhead expense. This is what you spent last year, and this is what you plan on spending this coming year on that particular expense. If you're using your own accounting, just be absolutely certain as you're going through this that each and every overhead line item that you're adding here is a cost that you don't estimate or don't include when you estimate. That's by definition what an overhead cost is. Great, that'll cover our normal expenses. Now we're going to go to wages. So I'm going to click on the wages tab. Don't put wages in this list of normal expenses because wages need to get labor burden added to them. So again, labor burden is the cost of payroll tax, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, maybe even vacation and sick pay. Costs that go over and above the employee's wage that the company has to factor. So again, we put our labor burden percentage up here. There's a good chance your labor burden percentage will be less than the field labor burden percentage. And that's typically because workers' comp is less for overhead staff. So if they're different, if this number is lower than the field labor one, that's okay too. If you don't really know or you're confused, just use the labor one from the field labor budget. It's probably a safe number. If anything, it's probably a little bit high. So in here, I would put the overhead wages, the person, what their previous salary is, what their forecast salary is, and it'll show you the difference. If the employee is paid hourly and not salary, it's no problem. Just calculate what their hourly wage is times the number of hours they would normally work to arrive at their forecast and previous wages. For the owner, you got to make sure that you're in here as well. It's important that an owner budgets the wage that they want to earn. No matter how you pay yourself. Maybe your accountant says take dividends or take money out of the company in another way other than just strictly payroll. That's fine. Listen to your accountant or get the best tax advice that you can. But you don't want to skip it for your operating budget. In order for your company to make enough money to pay you the salary you want to earn, you have to build your salary into the job pricing. And this is how we're going to do that. So if I'm an owner and I want to make $70,000 a year, then I've got to make sure I'm in here somewhere and my salary's in here somewhere so that that amount gets built into the prices we charge our customers via our overhead markups. Once you've got your wages in here, go ahead to the overhead equipment screen and exactly the calculators we used on the equipment budget. So if you haven't watched the equipment budget video, you can do so to learn how to use these calculators. But we've got the different pieces of overhead equipment we have in there and then calculators to calculate them. So either they're leased or owned, could even be a group. Generally, you wouldn't see a group in overhead, but this is how we're going to enter those expenses to come up with our equipment budget. I've also chosen to include overhead fuel and overhead repairs and maintenance here in the overhead equipment budget. They wouldn't be leased or loaned or anything like that. We're going to use a class called custom where you're able to just enter a flat rate. So for example, I got overhead fuel in here, I choose custom, and I enter the amount of overhead fuel I think we're going to use. This number here, overhead fuel, plus, I'm going back to the equipment budget here for a second, this number here, forecast fuel, should equal my company's total fuel spending. Remember when we did the overhead budget, we didn't put all our fuel in here. We put most of it in here, but we also put some in overhead to make sure that our overhead markups are going to cover the cost of fuel that doesn't get estimated. Salesperson's vehicles, owner's truck, that sort of thing. And that's pretty much it. If you need to add line items, of course, you got the new button down here. You can add as many as you want. If you want to take away line items, you can use the delete here and take away line items. You don't need these IDs here on the left-hand side, but it is handy to use to match your current company financials. Now let's get to some quick best practices. Number one, remember to budget yourself an owner's salary. Even if you work in the field, some salary should be budgeted in overhead to cover your cost for managing the business, hiring staff, estimating jobs, doing accounting, all the things you do as an owner to make that business function. Number two, you don't have to enter payroll tax. Now, most people's accounting will include the payroll taxes in their overhead. But remember, we added a percentage to our field labor and our overhead called field labor burden. Those numbers cover your overhead tax. You don't need to put it in your overhead again, or else you'll double cost it. Number three, include your overhead equipment. It's just a common thing that people forget. Don't forget to go to the overhead equipment budget and make sure you budget for things like owner's truck, any office cars or trucks, yard or shop vehicles, any equipment that doesn't go out to a job. Also, don't forget number four, to put some of your fuel and repairs in overhead. Typically, it's 10 to 30% of your total fuel spending. And number five, don't put depreciation in your overhead. Again, that's one of those things that'll often show up in your accounting overhead, but we've covered depreciation in our equipment cost calculators. Remember, we put in the purchase cost of the equipment, the year's life, the residual value. That's how we're recovering the depreciation. We don't need another line item in overhead. Otherwise, again, you'll double cost it. If you follow those rules, you should be on the track to success. If you have any other questions, and you probably will when it comes to overhead, every company's different, then by all means reach out to us. Live chat is in the top menu on the screen. You can hit that and talk to one of us live. Or you can go to golmn.help, where we've got a full library that's searchable, and where you're probably watching this video, that'll give you some not only helpful tips and tricks, but also some answers to frequently asked questions. And finally, if you can't get an answer from either of those, hit us up at advice@golmn.com. It's completely free to you, and we're always happy to help our users get the most out of our tools. Thanks for watching.